Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116. This is for a class for Monday, the 23rd, where we are putting some closure onto Citizen Kane and moving forward and talking about some short story. And you can also see that I wanted to talk about our first paper. So, as you know, we've spent a good amount of time watching Citizen Kane, and I'm the first to admit that when I first viewed Citizen Kane, when I was an undergraduate, I really didn't understand what was so important about this film that's usually ranked as number one in film lists such as the American Film Institute that I had given you a link to a couple of classes back, which is one of the reasons why I wanted you to see or at least clips of the documentary, The Battle Over Citizen Kane, so that you could understand some of the sordid history behind the film. And also, I wanted you to see Roger Ebert's analysis of Citizen Kane, where he goes through it as a film critic, scene by scene, so that you could get an idea of some of the ways that the film really was ahead of its time in so many different ways. And when you think about it from a plot perspective, the fact that we are getting all of these multiple narratives and we're never really getting the true sense of who Kane is. That's the way it was approached actually when I was an undergraduate and first exposed to Citizen Kane. Um, but if you want to think about it from a thematic perspective about the fall of a great man because of his hubris, if you wanted to think about it from a gender perspective and you wanted to talk a little bit about the portrayal of female in this particular film, if you wanted to talk about it from a cinematic perspective, as Roger Ebert did, and talk a little bit about the revolutionary camera angles and lighting techniques that we take for granted nowadays in modern film, but they were really created with Citizen Kane. If you want to think about the imagery of it, just the sign of no trespassing at the beginning and the very ending, the use of the jigsaw puzzle, which of course is also a wink and a nod to William Randolph Hearst's mistress who loved to play with jigsaw puzzles. So an audience would be very well aware that this film was loosely, quote unquote, based on William Randolph Hearst. And as we know, what he most objected to was not necessarily the negative portrayal of himself, but the negative portrayal of the mistress portrayed in the film Citizen Kane by Susan Alexander. And of course, Orson Welles maintained that this was purely a fictional work, but there are too many similarities between William Randolph Hearst and Charles Foster Kane to not see a connection between the two. And also, it just so turns out that Orson Welles, the boy genius, was filled with such arrogance, such hubris, that he too was a kind of William Randolph Hearst. And many of the fictionalized pieces in the film about William Randolph Hearst's life, for instance, being abandoned by his mother, that was actually Orson Welles's own history. So he embedded that within the film as well. But going back to the idea of the jigsaw puzzle, not only would this be a way for audiences to make a connection with William Randolph Hearst's mistress, Marion Davies, but also it works wonderfully in terms of what we are trying to do as audience and what the reporter is trying to do in the film, put together all the jigsaw pieces about this man's life. Rosebud being the main impetus, as Roger Ebert says, it answers everything and it answers nothing. Um, Probably one of the most famous literary or film cinema cinema literary symbols in history is this idea of the sled and Rosebud representing Charles Foster Kane's lost youth, which is what he ultimately wants in the end. Not money, not fame, not power. He wants love. Um, so you put all of these elements together, and the fact that this film crossed so many different genres is one of the things that Roger Ebert talked about as well. It's got drama, it's got romance, even has musical in it. When you think about some of the musical numbers, it's a mystery, so it can appeal to so many different levels of audience. Um, so when you think about, a film that's got cinematography and score and special effects, and again, many of the special effects in Citizen Kane are invisible to try to give a sense of realism to things that really aren't there, using matte drawings, for instance. Um, Lighting. And of course, black and white would have been the option at the time, but you can do wonderful things with shadow when you're filming in black and white. The acting, the directing, the writing, the editing, the set design, the makeup, the fact that they were able to age characters would have been revolutionary at the time. Citizen Kane has it all, and yet, if I were to talk about the perfect scene, and you can refer to the notes below, that has all of those elements, I would say it comes from a Netflix series that's called Stranger Things. And I remember when I first saw this scene, and I have a clip of it below. It probably won't make sense out of context if you're not familiar with the narrative and with the story, but trust me, for those of you who are familiar with the narrative and the story, if I had to identify a perfect scene, as wonderful as Citizen Kane is, I would instead identify the scene below, um, with a main character who is trying to run away from a monstrosity. It's a wonderful symbolic scene for depression and suicidal ideation. If you're watching the series, you probably understand some of this. Um, but nevertheless, if you haven't seen the series, I encourage you to watch it. I think it's quite well done. But at any rate, it's time to start thinking about what you might want to do with paper number one. And I had identified a due date approximately midway through the semester. That would be October 21st. But I have rolling deadlines, and starting at this point, you can begin thinking about writing papers. It'll be a critical paper, so you won't be doing any outside research. In other words, you'll be relying on your own interpretations and what you've learned in class. Approximately 4 to 5 pages, double space 1 inch margins, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to be able to identify your thesis. And it can be about either film, which for us in this unit would be Citizen Kane, or it can be a short story from this upcoming section, this unit that we're in. And we will be reading a handful of short stories over the next several classes and discussing them. So your paper topics are in the syllabus and other documents folder. Usually recommend that you make a hard copy just so that you've got access to it. But I wanted to talk a little bit about your paper topics now. And your paper topic for paper number one on this fiction section is going to be very similar to your paper topic for paper number two, which is going to be due on the drama section, which is our next section. And both will be critical papers, and both will be approximately 4 to 5 pages long. And what I've done is I've given you 4 topics, and you can choose to write on any of those topics, or you can create your own topic, and as long as you have it approved by me, then you can proceed. Do note that whatever you do have to address one of the texts that we are doing in class. So you can see that your selection texts are Citizen Kane as film, A Sorrowful Woman, a short story we'll be talking about shortly, The Story of an Hour, A Rose for Emily, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, Battle Royal, and Popular Mechanics. Those are the titles of all of the short stories that we will be reading and discussing now that we're done with film. So your first option is to identify a text from the fiction section, either the film Citizen Kane or one of the short stories, that you think should be included in the literary canon. Those works considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of academic study, detailing the reasons why. Or identify a text from the fiction section you think should not be included in the literary canon, detailing the reasons why. And you'll remember we talked a little bit about the canon towards the beginning of the semester, and we're going to revisit the idea of the canon today, actually. Or if you wanted to talk about a text from the fiction section that you think has the most contemporary relevance in our society, detailing the reasons why. And oftentimes, contemporary relevance is viewed as an element of canon, but it need not necessarily be the only element to justify something in canon. Or if you want to identify a text from the fiction section that you think has the least contemporary relevance in our society, detailing the reasons why. And the key is the why. There really are no right or wrong answers for any of these 4 questions. I'm more interested in your reasoning process. But regardless of the topic you choose, you need to provide textual evidence and details to support your arguments, which means you're going to need to use quotation, you're going to need to use paraphrase, you're going to need to use reference to the text, which we'll be talking about when we talk about the conventions of writing a paper. When you're writing about film, we usually talk about timestamps after a quotation. If you are talking about a written text, we usually talk about the page numbers after a quotation. And you can see that at the bottom of the handout, I have a question for you, that a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? That's a pretty tall order, to be clear, to be concise, to be believable, and to be graceful. And basically, I encourage you to start early and to write in stages rather than trying to do it all in one sitting right before the paper is due. And instead of wasting a lot of time trying to write the perfect first sentence, instead focus on ideas, not language, and focus on generating ideas so that whether you're brainstorming and just coming up with ideas or listing, the whole point of it is that it's for your eyes only. It doesn't have to be a good idea, it doesn't have to be a bad idea, it doesn't have to be a grammatically correct idea. Just get out as many ideas as you can and then revisit it sometime later, and let your subconscious do some of the work. Let your sleep mull over possibilities. In fact, it's been found that our REM sleep increases when we're working on a project, our dream sleep, or we are trying to learn new information. And then once we have completed that, then our REM sleep, our dream sleep, goes back to its normal state. In other words, something's going on in your subconscious when you are trying to learn something, so you should let that happen. So ideally, if you start your paper early enough, you can just spend some time generating ideas, put it away, go back to it, eliminate some of those ideas, go back to it, organize those ideas in an order in which you think you might want to discuss them, and then go back to it. And then you can begin formulating things like sentences and paragraphs, and then finally edit. Rather than, again, which is usually what happens, is that a writer will wait until a short amount of time before the assignment is due and try to do it all in one sitting. And it's a much more difficult exercise, usually, doing it that way. So that's why I wanted to talk about the first paper now, because some of you might be willing and able and wanting to write about Citizen Kane, but don't despair if you're not, because there are going to be other works that are coming up. And you'll see that in the notes below, I've got some of the major points from the textbook reading. Unfortunately, some of these readings I was not able to find for free online because they're copyright protected. These are usually the commentaries from the editors of the textbook. However, as you know, there is a copy on reserve in the GCC library of the textbook. And certainly whenever I can find the text for you, and luckily I've been able to find the actual short stories themselves for you, I will provide those free links. And the textbook talked about formulaic fiction, and it made a distinction between that and literature. The idea that fiction is basically anything that's written, or I should say literature is basically anything that's written, but we're not talking about an instruction manual, for instance. We're talking about fiction that involves some level of storytelling. And there are distinctions about how to evaluate quality, as to whether or not something is worth academic study. And if a piece of fiction is considered formulaic or popular fiction, is probably not worth our academic study. Um, it's usually written primarily for profit and entertainment. Not that there's anything wrong with profit and entertainment, but that usually means that it follows the formula. That usually means it's predictable. That usually means it is something that isn't going to require a lot of thought or a lot of effort from you. It's oftentimes very trite, and it's oftentimes genre literature. Not that there's anything wrong with genre literature. A genre is just a kind of category. And I'm the first to admit that I'm very fond of the horror genre. But it could be westerns, it could be romances, whatever the case may be. The textbook actually focused on romance novels, but it could have focused on any other genre. So this is in no way to disparage romance novels or to disparage those individuals who enjoy reading them, because again, they're written for entertainment and escapism. But there are very, very strict rules that you have to follow if you are writing in this kind of criteria. There's strict rules for plot. So they tell you how long it should be, and it shouldn't be too complicated. And it should be about a love story between a man and a woman. And again, this idea of following these rules satisfies the expectation of the reader. And the characters, there should be a strong male figure who ultimately is going to win the woman's love by the ending. There might be another woman who serves as a kind of foil, but ultimately she's no match um, for this woman, who's even detailed as what age she should be, between the ages of, her late teens to her late 20s. Um, and that's considered to be the epitome of the height of beauty for female. And that said, there's escapism involved in this, and that these characters can't have money problems, and they can't really have health problems, or at least nothing that can't be solved, because again, it's escapism. This is something that we um, are reading, not to reflect reality, and that the setting should be contemporary, and it should be exciting and exotic. And um, love scenes, while they are acceptable, they can't be too graphic. That's another genre. That's pornography. And what makes me sad is all of the rules about the writing and the length, that the writing has to be simplistic, and that even the length, and I always think about this, 10 to 12 chapters. When students ask me, I always think about this, how long should my paper be? And I don't mean to be facetious when I'm saying your paper should be as long as it needs to be. But the idea is that, can you imagine telling a painter how many colors this painter should use on their canvas? Your writing should be as long as it needs to be. And they give you an example in chapter, or on page 31. It's actually a chapter 11, from a romance novel entitled A Secret Sorrow. And we are given a summary of that novel. In maybe 7 or 8 sentences, and then we dive into the 11th chapter. This is a bad sign, by the way, if you can summarize something that easily and go into the 11th chapter and then ultimately be ready to read the story of Faye and Kai, who are experiencing some conflict. It turns out that they are dating. She wants to end the relationship. Kai demands to know why. She says it's because she's infertile, cannot have children. And then Kai very quickly basically comes up with the idea of adoption, and then they live happily ever after. Not to say that this is a serious issue amongst couples, but the fact that the resolution occurs within just a few sentences is indicative of what we have of a piece of formula fiction, that it's trite, it's predictable, It doesn't have a whole lot of depth and complexity. That said, it could be examined from an academic perspective. Certainly, it has been examined in terms of relationships. The assumption, for instance, that romance has to be heterosexual, or the way that gender is portrayed in typical romance novels. But the reality is that this piece probably does not require a lot of time from us from an academic perspective in terms of analysis, as opposed to the literature that we will be reading. And it's not primarily written for profit, though I'm sure that the authors would be quite pleased if they generated profit. But true artistry is created because there's a message that needs to be stated, not necessarily a profit that needs to be generated. It's not formulaic, it's not predictable, it's not trite, it's not easy. It's going to require a lot of effort and a lot of thought and a lot of analysis, multiple rereadings. Just like a really well done film will require multiple viewings. Um, it's not usually classified by a genre. There are no strict rules for plot or characters or setting or love scenes or writing or length. An example of this is A Sorrowful Woman. And while the two pieces, A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman, have very similar titles, the reality is that they are very different pieces of writing. So that hopefully, if nothing else, you can see that A Sorrowful Woman has much more depth, much more complexity, and really requires a lot more work from the reader. Um, and that's not to say that's something that you always want to do. There's nothing wrong with escapism and with entertainment, but the reality is if we're going to study literature from an academic perspective, or if we're going to talk about canon, those works that scholars and critics have deemed worthy of academic study, then we are probably going to have to put some effort into it. And we're reading short stories. We just don't have the time to read novels. We could. A short story, by definition, is a short piece of fiction. It usually deals with a single incident or episode. Um, and the textbook gives you some suggestions on how to write about fiction. And these are similar suggestions that you can consider when you're writing about film. Certainly, you can begin with plot. I mean, what's happening? But that's the least important piece. What's more important is why are those things happening? Character. Who are the characters and how do they interact with one another? What kind of language do they use? And do they change over the course of the story or not? Setting. How is setting used? If we're given information about setting, it's probably important, whether it be the time of day or it happens to be the season. And how might the setting be symbolic, representational of something else? Usually, when we talk about symbolism, we're talking about how something that's abstract, such as an emotion, can be represented by something concrete. Or, in other words, take the abstract idea of patriotism, how it could be symbolized by the concrete, let's say, flag. Sometimes symbolism is obvious and sometimes it's not. Perhaps authors might be using symbolism in really unique ways. What are the themes or messages? What's the style of writing? What's the diction, the use of language? What's the tone? Is it happy? Is it sad? Is there irony? In other words, is there some sort of an unexpected twist? A frisson, as they say in France, such as a firehouse burning down. Quite ironic there. They even give you a sample paper in progress on page 50. That might be something, at least page 50 for the version that, the edition that I had ordered for class. This might be something that you might want to dog ear and save, where it talks about how, as I had suggested, you want to write in stages. Perhaps you might want to write a journal, which is kind of like keeping a diary, but rather than talking about your personal life, you're writing about what you're studying, whether it be Citizen Kane or one of the short stories. Or brainstorming, as I was indicating, just trying to generate ideas. And then you can draft and then finally edit and submit. So that's there for you. So some suggestions for reading A Sorrowful Woman and all literature, and these will work as well for watching film. Author. So understanding who the author is. Certainly, we talked about the idea of how biography can give us a sense of text, but we need to be cautious because biography can also be misleading. One's biography need not necessarily be represented or represented within a particular text. So it is fiction after all. The date, very important to know where we are in terms of a particular time period. Now, the piece might be set in the past, it might be set in the future. That goes to the setting. But if we aren't told the time in which the setting takes place, then we have to assume the date of the piece. If it's worth analysis, it probably has contemporary relevance as well, but knowing the date and the time in which it was written or filmed is going to be very important in terms of our understanding the message. Title. Titles are very important. Names are very important. Think about the time, the kind of effort you might put into naming something. So why was a particular title chosen? Plot, as I said, you need to know what happened. But more importantly, why did those things happen? That's what we write about. The characters, the setting, the use of language, the themes. Endings are very important as well as our beginnings. Important quotations. And in fact, that could be a way that you could put together a paper. I myself did this when I was an undergraduate, where I would gather important quotes that I thought were relevant that I might want to talk about. And then I would organize those quotes in the order in which I thought I might want to talk about them. Then I would construct my arguments about those quotes and their relevance, and that basically was the outline of the paper that I was writing. You will often in your textbook have questions at the endings of the readings, and these questions will give you some suggestions, some guidelines about what could be important in a particular text. In fact, I might be addressing some of these over the course of the semester as well, so this might give you a little bit of a heads up as to what to look for. I know some students say that they don't like to read the questions before they actually read the text. They don't want spoilers. Other students say that they prefer to read the questions beforehand so that they know what to look for. So again, a lot of it depends on personal preference. And your questions, sometimes the questions are a lot more important than the answers. So those are just some things to consider as you are reading those pieces of literature. So I see this class here as basically our transition from film into literature. And our first piece of literature that we're reading as an example is A Sorrowful Woman. And yes, we did read A Secret Sorrow, but we read it merely as an example of something that was formulaic. A Sorrowful Woman, I think you'll find quite quickly, has a level of depth and sophistication that the previous piece just doesn't have. And you'll see that in the notes below in section 9, I had indicated that in addition to Sorrowful Woman, and luckily I was able to find a free link for that online, there also is the Story of an Hour, which was in our earlier set of readings about how to read literature, but I wanted us to revisit that in terms of analysis and interpretation. And also A Rose for Emily. There also is a very brief interview with the author entitled On a Rose. That unfortunately I was not able to find a link for, but I was able to find links for all of the others. So at this point, we are transitioning into some of the short stories, and I will be talking further about the paper and writing critical papers as the semester progresses. What I wanted to do was to leave you with an attendance question for our class discussion forum on the 25th, Wednesday. And if you need an extension, let me know. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn, though certainly you're encouraged to respond to your classmates. So this would give you an idea of some of the class discussion that we would be having. So I wanted to just sort of leave you with this because I know that you've probably had some long classes with watching Citizen Kane and then watching Roger Ebert's analysis of it. And unfortunately, you probably found that the volume was rather low on the link that I had given you. It's the only link I've been able to find, the only free link where we have that analysis. It's actually from a DVD, the Criterion Collection. And we have a copy of that on reserve in the GCC library, by the way, if you wanted to hear it. It really is an example of, or one of the best examples that I know of cinematic analysis. So I hope you were able to watch both of them and get an idea of how and why Citizen Kane is so important. But I understand that those were long pieces. So for today, I'll stop here and leave you with an attendance question for you to consider as we begin talking about short stories next class, specifically Sorrowful Woman. And you might note that a sorrowful woman begins with an opening statement, and that's called an epigraph when something begins with an opening statement. It's in italics and it's separate from the text itself. And this opening statement reads, "Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times." Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times. And my question to you is, why do you think a sorrowful woman begins with that opening statement? So I'm looking forward to reading your responses. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about short stories and papers. Take care. Bye-bye.